Hello, my name is Leon Greyling of EBnet.stream. Welcome to this 12-episode series on climate change called Heatwave Horizons. Over the next 12 episodes, we'll be unpacking for you what exactly is climate change, is it real, and how does it affect you, your business, the country, or the world that you live in. We'll be providing you with some practical examples and facts of how you can relate to climate change and what you can ultimately do to play your part in mitigating climate change. I look forward to engaging with our special guests over the 12 episodes, specialists in the world of climate change and finance. And we will also be talking about the ASSA Climate Index, a novel index that has been created by the Actuarial Society of South Africa to help us all better understand, plan, and price for the impact of climate change. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Sanlam for their support of this series and the fact that they are getting behind increasing our knowledge on a matter as important as climate change. So a big thank you to Sanlam.
I work hard for every rand I invest, and I want to know it's going somewhere safe.
His finances fuel their future. Securing both, that's our job. Give your clients the best investment solutions for their workforce. Partner with Sanlam Corporate Investments.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second episode of Heatwave Horizons here on EBnet Stream, brought to you by Sanlam. I'm joined today by two very prestigious guests, and we're going to be talking about the ripple effects of climate change on South Africa, both for us as individuals, for business, and for the country as a whole. So my guests today, firstly, Shamila Subramani, the CEO of the National Business Initiative and a non-executive director of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, as well as a member of the Presidential Climate Commission, which I would like to find out a little bit more about, as I think is pertinent to the topic for today. And then from one of the largest asset owners in South Africa, pension fund-wise, EPPF, we have Nomonde Zwane. Nomonde works on the multi-management front, assessing investment managers or asset managers, including on the Sustainability and Climate Change Fund. So it'll be fascinating to find out what they are doing practically in terms of supporting climate change mitigation. Shamila, Nomonde, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Leon. Thank you, Leon.
So if I could start off, Shamila, with you. The Presidential Climate Commission, could you maybe just give us a quick overview of what that is and what the task or intent is of that commission?
Thank you, Leon, and hello to the listeners. Great to be with you today. The Commission is a multi-stakeholder advisory body, and it was established to guide the country's response to climate change in the simplest terms. Its core role is to support what we refer to as a just transition. And so that's to ensure that we reduce emissions and build resilience while protecting jobs, livelihoods, and vulnerable communities. So set up with the very deliberate intent. And if we know that the activities generally around climate change have been somewhat fragmented, the Commission was then put together at the behest of the President around 2019. So it's just seen through the first 5-year term of commissioners, and I've obviously been appointed into the second set of commissioners now under this mandate. And so importantly, it brings together business, government, civil society, and labor, recognizing that climate change is a systemic issue that does cut across the economy. And so the body is an inclusive one for governance. And sorry, should I say right, rather internationally, we understand that it's very important that we have platforms for inclusivity around governance and decision making in relation to this, and that we're guided by science. And so this is a platform to do that, but bringing together those varying parties, and also being able to guide some of the research that's needed, and ultimately to make those recommendations into the National Assembly and to the President.
So I'd say it's a fact-based mission to ultimately guide policy making, as well as to guide those who need to implement what that policy might be, if it's even becomes legislation, perhaps.
Potentially, yes, but remember the focus is not just on policy making. It's about just understanding what those realities are and then guiding, I think, what that should be. So yes, some of that will absolutely translate into policy, but there's a fair amount that just is the engagement portion of it to understand what just means in a transition context and what that would be like for the country. And so whilst even some of the recommendations might not translate directly into policy, they could still be used by different sectors to guide their action.
So there's a stat that a friend of mine posted on LinkedIn the other day. I'm just trying to remember what it is. I'll actually find it here quickly, where basically what he was quoting was the World Benchmarking Alliance saying that only 18% of the world's 2,000 most influential companies are reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in line with the 1.5% target. Is that true? And how do you then relate that back to something like the Presidential Climate Commission and its role to try to get companies more engaged on the topic, should I say? And why perhaps are they hesitating?
Yeah. So, Leon, it's an interesting time to ask that question, right? When we look at what is happening in the globe right now, I don't think I need to open the conversation on geopolitics and tensions and everything that we've seen. So it's an interesting time to ask that specific question and what the impact has been on climate action. And we've certainly seen from certain quarters, influential ones, what seems to be a pulling back on any action and even recognition of climate as a challenge. And so without going into that too much, I think it still doesn't deviate from the facts and the science and everything that we've seen and global consensus. If we look at the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and those reports that have been put out year after year that are telling us this, and that is consensus views by some of the leading scientists in the world that come together to look at that. So on the one hand, we've got the science that we know, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the 1.5-degree target, because that's still what we need to work towards. Has there been pulling back? We have seen that globally. Are we on track on the collective commitments towards that? No, we're not on track. Absolutely not. Does it mean that we should continue down the path where we're going to do this? I think that's where the difference is that action still needs to be taken. It's been quite clear what the consequences are of not taking action. And so when we commit to not doing that, this is it. Are there different ways that we maybe need to think about how this is going to happen? Absolutely. What we are seeing, though, is that what we mustn't ignore is the evidence based to the contrary. The amount of investment, for example, that has gone into cleaner energy and renewables, the shifting of the power basis when we're seeing, big economies like China and India who are pushing into the renewable space and starting to reduce the emissions profile in countries like that, where there's huge growth in some of those newer industries that provide the jobs and the livelihoods that we need to look at going into the future. And so one needs to look at both. And so where the climate action might somehow be seen as being negative to growth and jobs, we've got to look at the counter evidence, and which is why I'm saying the fact base is important, and understanding that 1.5 degree absolutely matters to all of us because it's a collective impact that we will face should we not meet that.
So I have this ongoing debate with a colleague of mine. He keeps on, if we talk, first of all, we talk about ESG, which I think is just a completely misunderstood concept. And maybe we can come back to that later with Namonde as well. But he always says the S is more important in South Africa. We've got social issues that need to be dealt with first and foremost. And I get that. I fully understand that inequality and unemployment, these are serious, serious issues that we're facing. But you can't just ignore climate because the one actually leads into the other in some way. And I'd interviewed Hendrik du Toit, CEO of 91, a little while ago, and he gave exactly the same answer. So that ultimately, as a result of climate change and the effects of climate change, it's resulting in greater unemployment, housing issues, whatever it might be. Can you perhaps, Shamil, expand a little bit on that in terms of this, especially as from a presidential or governmental perspective, the balance between the social and the climate aspects and that they aren't mutually exclusive?
Absolutely. So thank you, Leon. I think, in South Africa, sometimes it's positioned as climate action and social priorities being competing. But in reality, they are so deeply interconnected, and you've given us a great lead into some of that already. So climate impact, first and foremost, is going to hit the poorest people the hardest. And we know that our context is that the clear challenges we face immediately, top of head, if you ask anybody, poverty, inequality, unemployment. The fact that something like that hits the poorest the hardest then directly talks to their ability to be able to adapt and to do that, and so can deepen inequality. That's the first one we need to look at. The just transition framing, and to get to your point around something like a presidential climate commission, but I think the mission for the country as a whole, the just transition framing helps us to ask better questions. So how do we reduce this climate risk while creating jobs, protecting household, and strengthening services? And that's what we need to look at. It is multifaceted. When we do that, we also look at it in the context of understanding the economic transition that is happening on one hand on its own, but also on the back of an energy transition that's happening. And how does that then factor in to the future of the economy as a whole? I'm sure Nomonde is going to come in a second and tell you about, from an investment perspective, what does that mean for the likes of a pension fund, your money that sits in there with long-term obligations that it needs to meet, but it needs to understand that risk and how that's manifesting with its immediate investment priorities. And so when we look at that, it's not just a kind of a social impact on either or, and one is competing with the other. Even if we look at it from an energy transition perspective, quite often, many of the sort of the more coal-fired or non-renewable energy sources also impact the environment, right? Just in terms of air quality, which then has an impact on health and well-being, which has an impact on the systems that support that, right? Which have a direct then cost into the fiscus, but also on human health, well-being, and even those people's employability prospects if they're struggling with health issues, as one of the examples. So those are the other costs that one needs to consider in the total cost of understanding where we are, the impacts of that. And that's just the direct impact of just part of the energy mix that we have. And we look at that. Also, your rural communities, low-income households are definitely the more exposed and less protected, as I've mentioned. And that is a heart of where some of our challenges are sitting. If you look at that from an economic context perspective and you think about it, many of those communities also rely heavily on what we call climate sensitive livelihoods, such as farming and informal work, as some of those, and they will have less access to mitigants such as insurance, better healthcare, better cooling, for example, if one of the variabilities is hotter climates in some instances, and resilient infrastructure. So this is why climate risk is also a social justice issue, but is very closely tied to the broader transformation of our economy at large. I'm going to leave it there for now, but I'm hoping that's helping. And,
so Leon, if I may come, if I may
Sure.
come in, maybe from an institutional investor perspective, you touch on a very important conundrum in terms of how then do we balance the environmental aspects to the social aspects. And it's things that we continuously discuss in terms of the environmental climate change issues are as equally as important as the social component. How we framed it within the ESCOM Pension and Provident Fund, which is now the EPPF, is we've created a broader sustainability framework. You mentioned earlier, the ESG acronym is got different connotations, but how we framed it is having a more overarching sustainability policy that is actually has also supportive policies such as a climate change policy and a social policy. Why that was important is to give both areas the attention they deserve. In terms of the climate policy and the framework, you look at just recently the World Economic Forum has issued that global risk report, of which we, from a global research perspective, we do track in terms of what are those key risks that as institutional investors we should be aware of, and also contextualize it in the South African context. And if you look at the recent report, not different to the 2025 report, in the long-term risks, climate change, the top three risks are environmental, environmental related risks, of which as an institutional investor, you need to look at your current investments and even new investments that you go into, whether it's in the listed space or the private market space, to say, then how do I create a framework from a policy perspective and also a framework that will inform our principles as we engage with stakeholders. As a fund, our biggest stakeholders are asset managers, as you can appreciate. It's important for us from a policy setting to have that quite crystal clear in terms of what would be those climate change frameworks and policies that we want to impart and actually communicate to our stakeholders, and how then do we create implementation plans and measurement outcomes out of those policies. Why we also prioritized, I think 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, we prioritized having a social policy that is also going to also equally address social issues and in the context of also environmental issues. We did realize that social issues were only being driven only from a transformation perspective, and actually that's quite multidimensional in terms of when you look at social issues, where the gender component is also a direct impact in terms of how we look at sustainability from a gender parity perspective. So from an institutional asset owner perspective, there is quite a deliberate focus in terms of having your engagement policies and frameworks quite clear around the climate change component, given in the context of risk, because also because we also manage internal funds. It is more of also a risk mitigation process that we also follow in terms of looking at ourselves as a fund in terms of what are those key risks from a climate change perspective that we need to start looking at when we look at engaging with our stakeholders from a scope 1, 2, and 3. What are the expectations that we want to have for asset managers in terms of looking at us internally and also setting those principles and priorities to say, can you walk with us on a journey? We could never follow a prescriptive approach. It's more of engagement, setting our principles so that we will walk on the journey with our external stakeholders. So both are equally important, but in the South African context, the reality is the social issues are more pronounced and they're more visible in terms of us creating the right policies to actually mitigate along the social issues such as alleviating poverty, and also, the direct impact that climate has in rural economies and also on agriculture is a reality in our world that we do need to collaboratively look at climate change aspects equally as important as social issues, because they are actually codependent in us finding solutions as institutional investors.
So I've been exceptionally impressed with what EPPF is doing. You're lucky because you have a very competent in-house team of people that can research, think, and discuss all of these things. The average pension fund or private capital doesn't have that benefit, if I could put it that way. And I've been on a drive to try to support all pension funds to be able to consider these kinds of factors. So I'll try to bring it down to a very practical state, which is we have to solve for unemployment, inequality, and so on, education, and all the rest within South Africa. It's critical. The government can't do so all on its own. There needs to be private capital support in order to get there. Now, in doing that, if you ignore climate change and you don't help also mitigate climate change, we just need to look at the Natal floods and the impact that had in terms of joblessness.
In April 2022, days of heavy rain across southeastern South Africa led to deadly floods. Particularly hard hit were areas in and around Durban. At least 341 people have been reported dead, and several thousand homes were damaged or destroyed. Critical infrastructure, including major roads, transportation, communication, and electrical systems, was also impacted by the flooding, and this damage greatly hampered recovery and relief efforts. Owing to the effects of La Niña, South Africa has seen above-average precipitation in 2022. In January, many regions experienced their heaviest rains since reliable records began in 1921. Southern Africa as a whole experienced multiple devastating tropical cyclones and flood events in the summer of 2021-22. Heavy rainfall began in earnest around 8 April and persisted for days. By 11 April, The cut-off low became established along the east coast of South Africa, with the South African Weather Service issuing a level 5 warning for the coast and adjacent interior of KwaZulu-Natal, which was subsequently upgraded to a level 8 and later a level 9 warning when the impact and scale of the rainfall was better understood.
What's the right word? Homelessness, all of these things taking place off the back of it. So they are ultimately interchanged. Now, that doesn't mean you back one thing over the other. It means you contribute to all. So as a pension fund, you have asset managers. Those asset managers predominantly invest in our listed markets. Those listed shares have to go through a process over time of hopefully getting to net zero, and there would be a cost associated with that, but there should be a requisite improvement in their environment, their growth potential over the longer term in that regard. So when you're assessing your asset managers, I like to ask them about how well they know the underlying companies they're investing in and their journey in the just transition. And I'm going to come back to Shamila shortly because you worked at the JSE for 15 years or so, and it'll be interesting to know what the sort of general thinking was in that regard. But then more direct from an impact perspective is investing in projects, okay, that mitigate climate change. And I want to unpack that a little bit, but then also support social development and initiatives and so on. And to me, it's all inclusive. It's about, we talk about Ubuntu, that's Ubuntu, is putting it all together in a way that you support without betting anything or taking on too much risk in any one particular area. But I think pension funds right now, they're stuck in a way of investing low risk, and they're not really getting the support of understanding exactly what this is all about and how they can support. And I keep on saying, I had a trustee, a chairperson of a fund the other day say to me, this is rubbish. Their job is to make sure the members retire comfortably. And I said, you're 100%. What about your member who's only retiring in 35 years from now? If they retire into an environment where it's not conducive, or we're sitting with inflation at massive levels, or social unrest for whatever reason, or a desert, extreme, version of it, you haven't done your job. So unless you contribute towards this picture, you're not actually fulfilling your fiduciary duty. So maybe I can start off just, Shamila, with you, the JSE and the role that they've played in terms of listed companies, and then I'd like to talk about impact investing, Nomonde, from your perspective, and also what's important to look at practically when considering opportunities there.
Thank you. Leon, maybe just give me a little bit of help on the JSE side, what specifically you wanted to just broadly what the JSE was looking at?
Yeah, so what is the JSE seeking to do to try to support companies? Sure. Because I remember during COVID time speaking to a couple of companies, I say, oh, there's all different reporting standards and this and that, and what do they focus on, what don't they focus on, and so on.
So thank you, Leon. So obviously, firstly stated that was my former job, so I'm speaking from that perspective. But the JSE, I think, very early on in the game, in the broader sustainability context, understood that capital markets have a role to play and will be impacted by the issues that we broadly consider under sustainability and sustainable development. And so that's across the spectrum, your E, S, and your G, to borrow that. It's just a useful kind of, I think, reference point. But the crux of the issues was, what exactly are you dealing with? What is the impact going to be? How's that going to manifest? What does that mean for potential asset value, share prices, so on and so forth? And so if you look at the role that the JSE plays, it is not itself an investor, but it is effectively the platform on which trading happens and matches, buyers and sellers, what that might be, and helps to mitigate some of the risk in that space, and is a place where you come together and are able to spread risk between investors and issuers, in the shortest form. But it does play multiple roles. So firstly, it is the platform. So absolutely, it's the hardware, it's the trading system and the mechanism, but it is also a regulator. So yes, Chinese walls within the JSE. So you have JSE issue and regulation that sits there, and that is largely where some of the effort was concentrated. But it looked at all three areas that it can influence, and understood that by virtue of the fact that so much of the economy was effectively listed on the capital markets, what could you do from that perspective to influence change? And one of the conduits absolutely is the reporting element of it. And there was never mandatory sustainability reporting on the JSE, and there still isn't. But what there was that very early in the game, like I said, started with at that stage the SRI index, and that was trying to encourage companies with greater public disclosure because that you're publicly listed on the issues around this, where there wasn't a lot of disclosure. And remember that that's a conduit then for better engagement, better reporting once it's out in the public domain, for public engagement around these issues that affect people. Because at the end of the day, you're investing in that company, you have an interest in what it's doing, but that company is also active in society and influences the outcome for all of us, to your point earlier on about this long-term trajectory. So, without rehashing all of that, started with the way it could start. Voluntary disclosures, the SRI index, which then eventually became the FTSE for Good, the FTSE Responsible Investment Index, and moved from being able to just, work with the exchange on giving them your information to public disclosure only that would be considered for your assessment in indices like that. So it became a sense of, how do I get better public disclosure? I'm going to be assessed for an index. I want to show up the best way I can. So can I start doing that? Ideally, once the reporting is the end of it, but the first part is the action that you're taking to get to that point. So it should be that sort of virtuous cycle of that. If I know I have to report on it, I'm more likely to do something in the background, reconsider my business models, how am I thinking about this, and how am I perceiving both the risks and the opportunities aligned to the issues that these sort of indices track. And so that was one way. The other way was that there were some mandatory related requirements on those issues that were part of the listings rules. So there were gender, for example, reporting on the gender composition of your board, and then broadly, I think it was about the transformation of your company, that became actually certain ones were mandatory. And so that was how the JSE tried to influence companies in different ways. There could be subsequent changes. I have been tracking all the listings requirements in the last 2-3 years, certainly. But that was kind of this progression where you had that. And then, of course, I think the last project that I actually had the privilege of overseeing was not long before I left the JSE, was the JSE Sustainability and Climate Disclosure Guidance. And so the notion was that, can we do something that has explicitly considered local context issues that can guide companies and be brought in, but at the same time being globally relevant? So stock take of whatever was happening globally, all the frameworks and standards that were there, but bringing in with a layer of local context and putting up, a suggested set of metrics that you could at least start to look at, each of them with a very clear understanding as to why they mattered and why they had impact for environment, society, or governance, and mattered. And so that was, I think, a step ahead of others in explaining to people why those metrics mattered. And it's still voluntary, but the indication, at least up front, was that was hugely useful, not just to listed companies, but to other industries and the companies in South Africa who could say, okay, here's something that is homegrown, but globally relevant. So that's where they tried to influence change and be able to do that. And of course, then the platform, right? The actual trading platform, the frameworks for green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, and transition bonds. That could be a place where you could come and capital raise to support these initiatives in that transition, in the greener space, in the social space, and give you a platform where there's a framework that you could reference that is publicly available, and that hopefully then makes that issuance something that is more attractive because it's sitting with the context of a regulated framework. So those were the ways in which the JSE tried to do this and say, how do we influence change? How do we influence thinking? But also, how do we make sure that we've got the platform where the money can match the outcome that you want? And I mean, it could broadly be considered impact investing, but it is really mainstream capital market instruments.
But I think it does stretch to impact investing, because you can impact invest on the public market side as well. And I think the JSE has created the right framework, and there's capital raising benefits of having a more social mindset in terms of what you're doing when you're running a business. But maybe address with the business schools. At some point in time, business leadership needs to perhaps appreciate that their future market depends on the health of society. It depends on the future lens that the consumer will have in assessing who they want to ultimately buy from. And I mean, we've all got business school backgrounds over here. Perhaps the business school, I need to challenge some of the business schools to change the curriculum, which I think they are, but it's always like something extra you do on the side rather than something mainstream. And perhaps that thinking needs to develop, to bring the heart and the head together over time, because ultimately I do believe companies that do adjust, do transition, will have a healthier, happy future. But it doesn't mean that you throw the baby out of the bathwater. It's like our energy needs. I mean, we do need to burn coal to keep the lights on so we can keep the economy going. But while we're doing that, we need to transition, and we need to support, other support renewable energy so that ultimately we can wind down. So that's, I see it as being very practical in that sense.
EBnet is proud to bring you top quality content from experts across the financial services industry in South Africa and internationally, for free. Your support helps us in doing this. All we ask is that you subscribe to our channels by clicking the subscribe button below. Share this video with others you think will benefit from it, and give us thumbs up if you are enjoying the content. That way, you help us help you. Thank you from the team at EBnet. For more great content, please visit www.ebnet.co.za.
Nomonde, coming to specific investment opportunities that relate to climate change mitigation, my experience in Europe has been that it's quite mainstream, that the average and very large pension funds have quite dedicated programs, if not teams, that focus on identifying those opportunities. They have a very clear taxonomy, anything from circularity to biodiversity to, renewable energy, whatever it might be. Where are we in South Africa in that regard? Is there demand for private capital? Is there deal flow on that side? And do we have a clear understanding of what ultimate impact we're trying to achieve?
So, Leon, definitely in South Africa, as an emerging market, there's quite a vast opportunity set within the private market space. When you're looking at, specific to the topic today around climate-related private market opportunities, definitely in the renewable space, there'll always be opportunity set. But as a retirement fund, where we're looking for also diversification, is also quite critical not to be over-concentrated in one sector. As you can appreciate, private markets has different components. You're looking at also infrastructure investments. Even within the infrastructure investments, there's different infrastructure capital that you can deploy. And also with the pace of innovation, you're looking at sectors such as going into the fiber sector from an innovation perspective. So it always is a task and a fiduciary duty to make sure whatever private market investments that you go into, there's a healthy balance, even from a diversifications of the deal flows that come through, even sectorially as well, so that there's not an over concentration in one sector, and that could create concentration risk within the portfolio. So how the EPPF private markets team, like you mentioned earlier, I mean, some of the offshore pension funds have dedicated teams that actually focus around climate-related or environmental-related aspects of private markets. We also have quite a well-resourced private markets team that not only looks at deal flow with only a sustainability lens on it, but rest assured, the sustainability component does play a role before any deal gets secured within the fund. It is a very, very important component because it then talks to our overall sustainability framework in terms of how do we look at opportunities within the private market space, prioritizing investment returns in terms of how sustainable are the investment returns within that project that we want to go into. Does it actually talk to the sustainability imperatives as well in the local context, because it's also quite important, as much as we adopt quite a lot of global standards and global frameworks, we do need to ensure that it does solve for the local context as well. How we also look at it, just not only in private markets, but also in listed, the guidelines and parameters from a due diligence perspective and expectations from managers, we set the same expectations as equally for offshore managers, similarly to local managers. Because why that's important, if you want to take the sustainability lens and you're going to be lenient to the offshore managers because of the limitations they would have in terms of implementing our local context, there's always various innovative ways where you can actually hold them accountable to the imperatives such as diversity. Do they create diversity within their investment teams? Do they create jobs within the investments or projects they go into? And how sustainable is that? Similarly to what we do with local managers, we put them on a very strict due diligence bar to say, if we're going to invest with you, these are the sustainability pillars we need to take with you and actually walk on the journey. Do you actually take your climate change and frameworks seriously within not only the portfolios that you manage, but also at firm level? Because we're not only just investing in investment strategies, but we're actually saying we are partnering with you and collaborating with you as a firm. So you cannot, as an asset manager, have a different climate related policy that's different to your firm. Then that means there's not alignment in terms of how you actually look at growing your business at firm level as well. And why it's also important for us to walk on that journey equally with global managers and local managers is when we look at our reporting, it's actually quite granular in its expert, because we look at how is it our direct mitigation strategies from scope 1. We look at the indirect scope 2 and 3, and scope 3, the indirect, is actually more important for us to understand the value chain of our asset managers and also overall our other stakeholders who actually play a meaningful part in terms of creating more robust investment strategies on a fund. So it is quite important.
Can I just quickly, quickly interrupt there? I don't think all of the audience is going to know what scope 1, 2, and 3 is.
Yes.
So let's help them.
Yeah, so to just help the audience in terms of when you're trying to measure the intensity of your portfolio and the carbon intensity in terms of how exposed are you to a portfolio that has large carbon emissions, there is a framework that actually measures in terms of when we talk about scope 1, what are those emissions as a firm that you are directly have direct impact on. For example, a company like ASSA, their scope 1 would be in terms of their operations, in terms of generating fuel, would account for scope 1. And then you get to the indirect emissions, scope 2 and 3, where you as a company in your operations, you would be contributing to those carbon emissions, but in an indirect way because of by virtue of you doing your business, but it's not your core direct emissions that you do in terms of your core business. And why scope 2 and 3 from an engagement perspective is important for institutional investors to understand. For example, in our world as a pension fund, we deal with asset managers. So the activities of asset managers is very important at firm level, and also the investment strategies that we invest in, so that we understand the carbon intensity on scope 2 and 3 emissions that have an indirect impact on our business as well by virtue of us having invested in the investment strategies. Why it's important even from a framework and regulatory perspective. A fund like EPPF, we are signatories to what we call the Principle of Responsible Investing from the UN, and also we are signatories of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance as well. And we support various initiatives such as the Carbon Disclosure Project as well. So we in supportive of quite a lot of global frameworks that actually some are mandatory, such as the PRI, for us to actually report on our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And hence, in terms of our due diligence process, how intense it is, and also our reporting process, we need to ensure that we understand our stakeholders from a full value chain in terms of when we engage with them. Can we say that we've got it 100% knowing, in terms of measurement? We take the disclosure guidelines, such as what Shamila had mentioned earlier, the JSE disclosure guidelines, as frameworks that actually try to set a standard framework in the local context. How it's important to have such guidelines. It actually creates, as a fund as well, when we look at the guidelines, an opportunity for us to do a gap analysis to say, where are we in terms of looking at the disclosure guidelines? Where are the areas where we actually fall short in terms of one, engagement, and also our processes as well with our stakeholders, and also our own internal processes? That's where we use the guidelines to actually close the gap from a gap analysis to say, then how do we move forward from an engagement and measurement perspective? And the guidelines also help us when we set frameworks, even as a fund, and policies, they're not stagnant, they're actually living documents, where we actually say, well, if the market has moved in this direction, then we need to actually look at our framework in terms of how then do we actually revise our framework so that it is actually relevant to the current economic environment. For example, Leon, I can tell you an example right now, what we're facing as a fund. As much as the discussion today, we're focusing around the climate and a bit of the aspects on the social impact. One cannot also ignore other secondary impacts in terms of the political impact that has transpired. When you look at the geopolitics and the stances in some of the regions that we operate in terms of how they've looked at climate-related issues, we do have, for example, an exposure in the US, and we cannot ignore in terms of when there's a regional regime change around, for example, climate-related issues such as what we've seen that has transpired in the US. Then we start questioning in terms of, from a risk management perspective and an engagement perspective, the exposures we have in the US. What is our principles as a fund? It's very important to be resolute in terms of your principles, in terms of how you move forward, and also engaging in those regions to say, this is our principles as a fund. As much as we've got exposure and there's a regime change in that region, we cannot backtrack in terms of directionally where we want to actually positively move as a fund. And it's actually quite important to have such a robust governance structure that's managed at board level and is translated to executive level and management level, so that the messaging to stakeholders, despite where you are exposed regionally, we want to measure positive outcomes in the South African context for our members and for long-term retirement fund income. But in doing that, we understand the context of the complex environment that we operate in. We can't ignore the heightened geopolitical risks that we are exposed to, but it's in how clearly we articulate our principles and policies, and actually walk on the journey, and also understand the difficulties that our stakeholders also have, because I think it's a two-way street in trying to find a solution, not only to rubber stamp as an asset owner your own principles blindly, without actually being sensitive to what are the challenges of some of the regional dynamics that we are actually exposed to now.
There's a reason I wanted EPPF on this series. It's because I'm aware of the things that you have been doing. I've attended the quarterly breakfasts and so on, where you're talking about the efforts that you've made. And I saw Shamila there also applauding what you guys are doing, and I agree 100%. Now I'm going to be a bit unfair, not to you, but to generally, myself included, all of us. There was a study done by, I think it was the IMF and the FSCA back in 2019 or whatever, where they surveyed pension funds and the number of them that had a sustainability policy. And I think 80% of them came back to suggest we've got one. I don't think most of them could tell you where it was, but they said they had one. And only, I think something like 10% said they were actually actively monitoring it. All right, so that's number one. I quoted earlier the number of companies of the top 2,000 that are making the inroads. I think we're missing a trick, if I could put it that way. So I'm going to make a statement and leave it with you. We need to learn to collaborate, because not everyone has the same level of resource to be able to unpack things perhaps the way that you guys have at EPPF. And I'm not certain all of the consultants in South Africa are taking the effort. Why? Because there's 3 dominant consultants, so there's not massive competition. The 10 largest asset managers take up 60% of private capital.
Capital, yeah.
So there's not enough innovation that's really taking place. So the conversation's important. The drive to get people to think, but also finding ways of collaborating, because a lot of pension funds sitting 2 to 3% in private markets, and the excuse is always liquidity or pricing issues. Well, let's collaborate. Let's create a secondary market. Let's create research for co-investments to lower the costs. I don't see those innovations coming through to make it more accessible so that we can ultimately deal with these kinds of issues. So maybe let me just pause there, and I'll give you 1 minute each just to reflect on that. And then I would like to just quickly throw a couple of quick fire questions at you for the benefit of the audience around actual climate change impact. So Shamila, would you want to perhaps comment on that?
Thank you, Leon. Maybe slightly more than 1 minute, because you're pointing to saying there's more collaboration, and you've sketched out so beautifully where you think that needs to be. I think that there's a step further that I would urge that the financial sector needs to go, which is to actually put its weight behind the policy landscape that is going to shape where the country, the future of the economy. I mean, because of the prescription, there's a certain amount you have to hold locally. You are exposed to risk locally, but you also have a huge influence through that money on what can shape the future of the industries. And so the weighing in on the policy to look at saying, what are those industries of the future? What should we be investing in right now that gives us this matching of this long-term liability that we need to have with the appropriate level of investments that can grow over time? The full understanding of stranded assets, what that means for the market, understanding and being able to see from a pricing perspective into the future, what does that look like in some of those share prices when you do that? And I think not enough has been done on that for the direct implication on those investments. So I think that is a huge role to play. The other one, and talks to a lot of the work that the NBI has done, which is to say, where is the collaborative work on understanding what a low carbon development pathway needs to look like for the economy, or can look like for the key sectors that effectively even our money, the 3 of us sitting in this room, is all exposed to. And so being able to understand that and then match them with some of the imperatives around investing. And you've pointed out so clearly the full swathe of that value chain. It's obviously the money is sitting with the asset owners, and EPPF and the likes had a huge role to play in influencing what they want, because work that I'd done a while ago suggested that the consultants were saying, oh, but the asset owners are not telling us what to do. That's why we're not translating it into this. And so you speak to the asset owners, and then the asset owners have a huge role to play because they effectively work with the consultants and tell you what it is you need to do, but the consultants influence both ways. The asset managers quite often will sit there and say, well, they're not telling us, we have to go with the mandate that we're given. And it's a very simplistic understanding, but it's that full spectrum that needs to do that. Then you have the markets that need to create the right instruments. And I think I'm going to argue the JSE's try to do what it can in that space. But there's a huge other space, not just the listed market across the board, that needs to look at that. But the imperatives of what it is we want to think about and how we want to transition this economy in which we need to invest in has huge opportunity is the space I think we're potentially missing for that collaborative action. It became even more evident to me in a role like the NBI, where we work with all the sectors in the economy, and the financial sector are huge members of ours. So I think that for me is where we really need to start thinking that step ahead of saying we're not just going to be passively with our policy what we're doing, but that policy can shape the future. And are we sufficiently taking cognizance of what that future could look like for this economy in that context and playing a stronger role there? So Leon, just a slightly different take, but I thought I just had to say that, bringing together my past and my current hats.
I appreciate that. Because we really do need to apply our minds to this problem in I think in a different way, because if we leave it to we call it the natural market forces, it's going to take a lot longer because of some of the different views that are espoused these days. So there's more than enough reason and noise to deny. That's the reality.
Yeah.
I wonder, how do you see it?
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to support Shamila's view around how then do we move it to a more actionable and measurable approach. Like you mentioned earlier, I mean, a policy is just as good as the paper it's written on, unless you actually put some measurement outcomes to it. I think as an industry, in terms of us putting action in terms of how then can we move forward from a collaborative perspective, we do need to start measuring things. It needs to be a data-driven approach. I think without data, we cannot actually even come up with any solution if you're not measuring whether we're moving progressively. And why I mentioned the data-driven approach, I did happen to be quite intimately involved with the actual Society of South Africa in my other capacity as an independent PO, but actually also working closely with John Anderson around the work they've done, particularly around that climate index that they've created, which for me is one of the most groundbreaking innovations that we've seen. Someone actually trying, a body actually trying to get it to a more data-driven, science-driven approach in terms of how do we have that intervention, not only for institutional retirement funds, but also for product houses like insurers. How do you then measure and actually create products that are going to be climate sensitive and resilient in that respect? So for me, a data-driven approach and using guidelines that are available, especially even from the ASSA index and climate index, is going to be actually critical in terms of how then do we shift the needle. Why I actually like the work they've done, if you look at it, they've created a whole scenario analysis and a toolkit for stakeholders to look through, qualitative and quantitative assessment in terms of how then, on the quantitative side, if you had to look at a DC fund, quantitatively, how do I create scenarios in terms of how am I going to mitigate my investment strategy in terms of trying to align to the long-term climate-related targets? When you're looking at the age analysis of my retirement fund, the mortality rate and longevity aspects that are actually unpanning in South Africa, how is my member demographics actually falling in line with those actuarial scenarios that the climate index is trying to show from a DC retirement fund perspective? Then how then can I measure and actually show, based on the different scenarios, are my members going to actually have a climate sensitive income replacement ratio in the DC world? When we translate that into the DB world, in the index actually does scenario analysis around how sustainable is your funding level. If you had to put different scenarios, stress tested across all scenarios, you're still using mortality and longevity as a key factors in terms of your scenarios. Then how sustainable in this DB space will my funding level be in terms of being able to capitalize some of the liabilities I have within the DB fund? So I think, Leon, collaboration and a data-driven approach is actually going to yield to more sustainable outcomes. From a policy setting, the likes of Shamila, in terms of the policy framework, is something that you mentioned earlier in terms of the maturity level of different retirement funds is actually quite, different. I mean, the likes of an EPPF, we understand even the national dialogue in terms of what are the critical levers we need to pull as a retirement fund in the context of the national dialogue. But the reality is different retirement funds are at different maturity levels. And then how then do we bring policy to a practical, implementable solution, whether we do it through the regulator, the FSCA, but we do need to, an average trustee these days, you do need to understand the national imperative before you even set a strategy of a retirement fund, which is quite critical, and understand the frameworks that are actually working. What are those data-driven frameworks that I can measure and say, I need my consultant to tell me about this measurement, because at national level it's important, at fund level it's important, and then how does it translate to the income retirement outcomes for members? And until we have such robust processes, we will create a bigger gap. That's why the collaboration to collaborate as an industry, and also collaborate even between the public and private sector to find the solution is going to be quite critical.
100%. And I think the other, we need to keep pushing the message that it doesn't mean lower return, that in fact you can generate strong returns through supporting initiatives like this, but they're very easy to sell because they pull on the heartstrings. So those who slap UN SDGs all over the marketing material, beware, make sure there is measurement. If you cannot measure, you cannot manage to get to that outcome, and that's vitally important. So on that note, we have gone longer. I said at the start, it's going to be difficult to keep us all to the time. I would just like to quickly throw out, just from a layman's perspective, climate change, the impact on our water. What could that be, very quickly?
I can start. That's fine. I mean, we're already a water-stressed country, so it's going to affect water through your higher temperatures, our increased evaporation, more intense droughts, and more variable rainfall. And so even when rainfall does increase in certain areas, it can come in short bursts, which then doesn't replenish dams, for example, effectively. So there's just one of the ways in which that can happen. And the variability then, of course, matters for agriculture. It matters for infrastructure. It matters for infrastructure resilience as well. I mean, I'm not sure where about in Joburg any of you sit, but last night there was an intense storm. And I mean, you ask yourself, how many times in our lifetime, apart from the last few years, have we really felt such intensity outside of the norm? And are we set up to do that? So there's the cost on that. I'm talking just from the risk perspective. Of course, the human impact of that. And is very closely related also to vector-borne diseases, which is the other side of it. And we often don't put those two together, which has a direct human health impact. And again, your poorest people are the hardest hit and least able to adapt to that. And then there's a knock-on impact, of course, on the public healthcare system as well. So those are some of the areas, just in short. And then the availability, right? I won't talk about the infrastructure maintenance issues, which is one of the issues and challenges, obviously. But then the availability starts to directly impact not just, health and well-being just of citizens, but the availability of business to do business and the resilience of the economy as a whole.
So you just touched on the two additional ones that are not only two additional ones, but two of the additional ones. Impact on health, quite clear that, I mean, I've never seen, I've got two healthy children, but with more allergies than I knew were possible. But also it tends to hit the poorer people in the rural areas. Why? Because they don't have the same infrastructure access that perhaps the rest of us have. But then what's also the impact on our food supply?
Naman, did you want to go first?
I mean, I'm not a agri or food expert, but I mean, Shamila touched on a lot of the points where climate change has a direct impact. I mean, food security is the direct impact that you're seeing, especially in the low LSM market. Not only rural. I mean, you've got the urban people where, I mean, the rand is not stretching as much in terms of being able to afford just basic needs. So the direct impact on crops and also, I mean, livestock. We've seen, I think you recall in the 2024 droughts, I mean, those were quite intense when we experienced droughts in South Africa, how much of an impact it had, not only crop, but also livestock. So the only sad part is it actually affects the poorest of the poor in terms of them being able to afford basic needs such as, your basic staples, because of scarcity of food, then prices go up, then there is no greater supply to actually supply the masses. So it's something that we cannot also exonerate ourselves, and the impact on the lower LSM has a direct impact even to the highest LSM, because it has a rippling economic effect in terms of if people can't just afford basic nutrition, it translates into education system. I mean, if a child cannot even have breakfast, how then can they go to school and have a proper education? The long-term effects, unfortunately, will have it. The economic impact will be more long-term, where you find that less and less kids are actually getting even into matric and graduating to go to postgraduate studies or TVET colleges or upgrading on skills and everything. So that long-term impact, and that's why I like the global risk report, the WEF global risk report, because it helps you look at things more long-term and actually solution now to have short and medium-term goals to say, what are the interventions that we need to have so that we alleviate those long-term risks, because we may not be there in 20 or 30 years' time. But trust me, our kids will actually have that impact in terms of a society that's less educated, a society that's actually sickly, because without food and nutrition, you're prone to more diseases. And it is something that we need to solve for. I mean, there's a famous, I think quote, I heard it from Muteri one time, Muteri Wahome, which I think Leon, you know very well, where we need to plant the trees now that we may not actually enjoy the shades of those trees, something along those lines. And with that mentality, the leadership today in all aspects, whether it's in the public or private sector, if we approach it that way to say, we are actually solving for tomorrow's problems, because we can see the trajectory in terms of if we don't solve it, then it's going to be quite, an unjust society in future.
I'd actually like to, sorry, Shamila, yes?
I was just going to add, I mean, completely support what Nomonde has said. And, that knock-on effect on food prices, nutrition and rural incomes is something we need to pay particular attention to. And the manifestation of the issues around farming food production will be different in different regions in the world, but there's a really huge consequence given the challenges we already have. And I think there with the ASSA, the index, I think the extreme temperature metrics help track systemic agricultural risk. And this is critical when the rubber hits the road of how do we start understanding that. And so it looks at that, not just, extreme weather events. So that translation, and then I'd also encourage us to look into the future, into this duality of climate change and nature. Food production, of course, sits within there and is very squarely in the nature space as well. But there's a broader context of that, because the resilience of the ecosystem to be able to help us fight and mitigate some of these risks and to deal with them, and adapting to that is also under threat. Because we're seeing huge species decline across the world, both animal and plant species. What we're not necessarily understanding fully is that those things help create an ecosystem which supports us to be able to deal with all of these, and it's just going to increase the variability. And so the other side of assessing risk absolutely has to understand the ecological impact of the decreasing populations, animal populations, but also plant species, because you need that variability. You need those ecosystems intact to help to increase that. We talked about water just now. If you take away a lot of that, you're removing the natural buffers that we have to be able to help us to shoulder some of that impact. And when we talk about carbon, talk about carbon, yes, is one thing, the emissions is one thing, but the absorptive capacity is the other. So farming methods and methodologies are critical, but also just preserving those carbon sinks that help us to do that. If we deteriorating and declining on this on one side, but we're also emissions are not declining either, we effectively just accelerating the impacts that we have. And so understanding that nexus, I think, is critical in addition to all the fantastic points that Nomonde has made.
So I'm going to cut us at that point, because I need to leave space for the next 10 episodes. Guys, thank you so much for joining us, and a big thank you to the role that you're playing ultimately as well in your personal capacity and the organizations that you're a part of. I'd like to just end off by saying to those denialists out there who say this is just part of the normal course of events, even so, why not seek to mitigate it? If that is the case, you might not feel it yourself, be it in your own life or your back pocket, but others are influenced. So why not seek to mitigate ultimately the effect. I do not believe it's just natural what is taking place. It's just for me
Yeah.
to state that. But at the end of the day, there's absolutely no reason, if we have the means, to not take some action against it. So Namonde, Shamila, thank you very, very much for joining us here on Heatwave Horizons. We wish you all the very best. If you ever want to publish anything to our community at EBnet, please feel free to send me a note, an article, or a request for an interview, and we would happily have you on again.
Thank you so much, Leon.